she was treating them with profound respect. She was teaching teachers how to not teach, but rather to help children to learn how to learn, and then exposing them to incredibly enriched intellectual content, but mostly delivered through direct experience, through stories, because stories have always been eternally a way that we have taught our children, by listening to them, by encouraging them to tell their stories, to feel they have something to say, and by taking abstractions like mathematics, geometry, engineering, all the things that for most of us are just memorized. She made it three-dimensional and concrete. And she realized that, you know, if a 3-year-old doesn't know, he can't learn how to read.
Right.
So if you do it correctly, not all of them will do it, but they just explode into it. And so around the world, 113 years later, almost everyone has heard the name Montessori.
Right.
They just don't really know what it is, and they can't understand why it works, but it does.
Great story on Maria Montessori from Tim Selden. Tim, when I visited your office in Lakewood Ranch, we had a great chat, and you mentioned that you had a chance to talk to Piaget.
Yeah.
Piaget, which is, to me, is one of the greatest child psychologists in the history of humankind. Can you elaborate on that encounter a little bit with Piaget?
Well, yes. I mean, I only had 1 hour-long meeting with Dr. Piaget in the last year of his life. So I was a young man, and he was a very old man. But one of the things that I had learned by researching in the Library of Congress was that Dr. Jean Piaget, well, first off, he really was not a psychologist. He would have called himself a genetic epistemologist. What he was doing was trying to understand how children learn to think, how they learn to develop their understanding of things like morals and government and God and lies and truth versus fabrications and geometry and math and language. He was very interested in how children, how their brains developed. What I didn't know until I stumbled on it was that Dr. Piaget ran a Montessori school, because it never shows up in his books. He ran the Institut Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Les Maisons des Enfants, which is one of the large Montessori schools in those days in Geneva. He was the president of the Swiss Montessori Society. He was, for a time, the president of the European Montessori Society. What he said to me is, Maria Montessori didn't invent what she did out of thin air. Like all of us, her work was inspired by the work of other people who came before her, and she kept trying to push it forward and create a collaborative community of scientists who were focused on children, how they learn, how their bodies develop, how society molds them, to what extent is being human transcendent of the language you speak, the family culture that you grow up in, and of course some of that is what you would call psychotherapy, or how do some people become desperately confused and unhappy or violent. But Piaget was particularly interested in how children learn to think. So today you'll see educators around the world who say, I'm a constructivist educator, which simply means I believe in trying to help children to not just memorize, but to really visualize, understand, and be able to replicate what we're talking about. That they know it well enough that just as your sound engineer there has mastered that soundboard in front of him through years and years of theory and practice, it becomes second nature. Piaget basically was an anthropologist too, because he learned by asking kids to explain to him, well, how did you solve that? Well, that's exactly what Montessori did. And he said, of course, all I'm doing is what Dr. Montessori did, what she taught me to do. and I carried it on. So I think Jean Piaget, Vygotsky is another. There's so many people. Lily Peller. Many of us have heard of Alfred Adler and Erik Erikson. They were also involved with the Montessori community. Dr. Montessori was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud. He himself, the two of them never met. They corresponded. But Dr. Freud's daughter, Anna, is a world-famous psychologist and Montessori educator.
Mm-hmm. Now, this is such a big subject. This is the first part of our session, the radio show. When did Montessori get introduced in the U.S.?
Oh, gosh. In 1907, she started that first school. In 1908, the University of Rome asked her to give a series of public lectures because people were so excited. I mean, it's a really interesting story. The Queen of Italy heard from the press what was happening. And, I mean, this reporter had actually shown up one day with someone from the British Embassy, and it was a day when school closed half day. So here's this school in this big apartment complex, and it's locked up, and the children are playing outside, and they say, Mister, what are you here for? And he said, I wanted to see the children's house. I said, well, we go to the children's house, but it's closed today. And he said, oh, that's too bad. He said, not a problem, mister. Just boost me up. I'll go in the window. I'll open it up. So they open up the window, and these 60 children all gather from the neighborhood, and they go about, they set up, and they run the school. And the way they spoke, the reporter just started writing articles saying, this is miraculous what I'm seeing here. And then the Queen of Italy came to see the school, and she brought a basket of cookies in geometric shapes. Mm-hmm. And instead of eating the cookies, the children said, a trapezoid. That's a rectangle.
That's a rectangle.
That's an ellipse. Anyway, the long and the short of it is there are lots of good stories about Montessori and how it came to be known all over the world. Right. In this country, 1908, there was an American woman named Dorothy Canfield Fisher living in Rome at the embassy. She was a famous author. She came back to the United States, wrote a book called A Montessori Mother. That book is still available through the Google archives. It's fascinating. By 1911, Woodrow Wilson had set up a Montessori school in the basement of the White House. Alexander Bell had created the school that became the school that I attended in Tarrytown, New York. There was a Montessori school running that's actually supposed to be the first and oldest surviving Montessori school in the United States. But there have been Montessori schools all over the world since the early 1907, 1908.
We got 2 minutes to finish the first segment of this show, this radio show. You just mentioned Woodrow Wilson. He was the President of the United States.
He was indeed.
What was he doing running a Montessori in the White House?
I want you to understand the results that Montessori got were so dramatically different than what anyone had ever seen before.
Wow.
And they were able to replicate it in enough cases that they began to realize here's this world-famous scientist, internationally acclaimed scientist, who always swore, I will have nothing, in those days you became a mother, a nun, or teacher. And she said, never will I teach. And here she is, this world-acclaimed person who has created this replicable, scientifically based approach, and people all over the world were saying, I want that for my country. That's the future of my workplace.
CQ Radio, our guest is Tim Shelton, the great Montessori guy, we call the great Montessori person in U.S. We're going to take a few-minute break. This is the first segment. The second segment, we're going to continue interviewing our guest, Mr. Shelton, about Maria Montessori, about his trip to Iraq, about Montessori in the White House. There's more and more to come.